Welcome, everyone. My name is Carol Ann McGregor. I'm the Vice President, Academic and Dean here at St. Jerome's University. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. I'd like to start this evening by offering a territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect that St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo reside and operate on the traditional territory of the Arawandran, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our university is situated on the Haldeman Tract, land Frederick Haldeman granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River in 1784 that includes 10 kilometers on both sides of the Grand River and extends from its source to Lake Erie. We give thanks for the privilege to work and live on this land, and we are committed to building respectful relationships with Indigenous people and communities to enhance our knowledge and learn how we can have an active role in reconciliation. So welcome to those of you who are longtime attendees of this Lectures in Catholic Experience lecture series, and a special warm welcome to those of you who might be joining us for the first time this evening because you have a special interest in this topic or are previously familiar with the work of our guest speaker, Dr. Jonathan Malesic. Let me just give you a little bit of a history about this series, and then I'll introduce our speaker for this evening. So the Lectures in Catholic Experience have been offered since 1982. It's a series of lectures we offer to our local community, providing opportunities for the university to engage in critical issues of our time with people in the broader community. So we've invited scholars, activists, experts, and religious leaders to address subjects in areas such as religion and politics, spirituality, healthcare, international relations and human rights, ecological responsibility, religious pluralism, ecumenism, interfaith dialogue, religion in the media, and many others. Some of you will know that in the fall, we welcomed Archbishop Don Bolin to speak on the doctrine of discovery and the Catholic Church's ongoing commitments to truth and reconciliation. We also had alumni of St. Jerome's, Joe and Stephanie Mancini, speak about the ideological foundations and their commitment to addressing the social issues of the day at the Working Center. Both of those talks are on our website, sju.ca/LCE, for those of you who may not have gotten a chance to see them in the fall. This is our first talk of the winter series. It continues our theme for the year, which is legacies and lessons. So let me just tell you a little bit about how this talk came to be and about our speaker. The idea for inviting Dr. Jonathan Malesic to this talk emerged back in May 2023. I came across an article in a higher education news outlet that made reference to this new book, The End of Burnout, How Work Drains Us and How to Build Better Lives. I was immediately intrigued because burnout struck me as one of those Princess Bride words. Those of you who've seen the movie will know the classic line is, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." Students are burnt out, staff are burnt out, faculty are burnt out, your doctor is burnt out, your nurse is definitely burnt out, children under 12 are burnt out, maybe you're burnt out, maybe I'm burnt out. If everyone else is, maybe I am too. I ordered the book hoping to better understand what folks mean when they use the term burnout, and in hopes of understanding what our obligations to each other are as friends and family or as employers, if we care, as Catholics do, about human dignity and caring for people as whole persons. When I finished the book, I wrote to John and asked if he might be interested in joining us for a future Lectures in Catholic Experience. I'm grateful he agreed. It turns out he has a fondness for Canada as a former resident of Buffalo, so tonight we're glad to have him almost home. He's here to share a bit about his book project and particularly to emphasize some of the places that intersect with our themes for the year, legacies and lessons. For those of you who weren't previously familiar with his work, he has had work appear in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Chronicle of Higher Education, America, Commonweal, Notre Dame Magazine, The Guardian, the Hedgehog Review, and other outlets. His writing has been recognized by Best American Essays, Best American Food Writing, and the book that forms the basis of tonight's talk has been selected as Best Book of 2022 by Amazon and the Next Big Idea Club. It's being translated into 9 languages. He holds a PhD in religious studies from the University of Virginia and teaches writing at Southern Methodist University and the University of Texas at Dallas. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to tonight's speaker, Jonathan Malesic.
Thank you so much, Carol Ann, and thank you as well to Jamie Phillip for doing a lot of work to make this event possible, and to to St. Jerome's University and the Waterloo Kitchener community more broadly for your tremendous hospitality. This is my first time in Waterloo. As Caroline mentioned, I grew up in Buffalo, and I played youth hockey. And so, I've been to Kitchener. And periodically, my team would, come up to Kitchener to play a team here or, play in a tournament. And I remember very fondly the tremendous hospitality shown to us by the families who would put us up for the night. And we'd order pizza and watch movies, and, it was always fun, like the sleepover. That hospitality, curiously, did not extend onto the ice, where my team was routinely humiliated. So I'm glad to be here, and particularly glad knowing that whatever else happens tonight, I'm not going to lose 12-0. And the reason is I'm not here to play hockey. I'm here to talk about burnout. And burnout in the last few years has become something of a buzzword. And particularly during the pandemic and its aftermath, burnout has become the go-to term for talking about our negative experience with work. And if you pay attention to the discourse about burnout, you find these alarming and conflicting headlines and studies that sometimes stretch the bounds of credibility. So you see, for instance, 75% of workers are burned out. 90% are. 96% of millennials are burned out. The term has also made its way well beyond the world of work to encompass all areas of life. So you hear about things like dating app burnout, house hunting burnout, or my personal favorite, Burning Man burnout. And there is a real phenomenon here. And we know, possibly on a personal level, that work has gotten harder in the past few years. But these clickbait articles and alarmist figures are only possible for exactly the reason that Carol Ann mentioned, that we don't have, or they at least are not using, consistent definitions and measurements of the term burnout. So that's where we have to begin. We have to start with a better definition. And so I think a better definition, whoops, wrong direction. So better definition, this is a broad definition, is that burnout is I actually have to go like this to read my own slide. Burnout is the experience, it's the experience of being stretched across a gap between your ideals for work and the reality of your job. So our metaphor for burnout is maybe a little bit inaccurate, though we're probably stuck with it. The metaphor is of burning, as if you have a tank of fuel that you burn in order to do things, and then you burn through it, and you're eventually burned out, and you're out of fuel. But But I don't think that that metaphor really makes sense of the experience of burnout. I think it makes more sense to think of it in terms of stretching. You're stretching across this gap between ideal and reality, and that is the experience of burnout. But what do I mean by ideals? So ideals are the things that you expect from work. They can be material ideals like salary and benefits and so on, but they can also be immaterial. Community can be an ideal of work, dignity. There's an ideal often of service or self-expression or creativity that we seek through our work. The ideals are things that you feel you have been promised, whether explicitly, well, it could be implicitly, but explicitly or implicitly by your employer, so in your contract, or maybe less formally than that, but also by society. We make promises to workers that become their ideals. And then, of course, the reality does not always measure up to those ideals. So when there's a gap between ideal and reality over a long period of time, you try to hold them together. But, if you're unable to or you're stretched between them, then you undergo what we call burnout. And importantly, burnout is a chronic condition. You can't be burned out for a week. At the end of a big project at work or, in academia, at the end of a semester, you probably aren't burned out. If you can rest and feel better and get back to kind of your normal self, then it wasn't burnout that you were undergoing. If you rest and you don't feel any better, then what you're undergoing is probably more than ordinary tiredness and may very well be burnout. I like to think of burnout as this experience of like walking on a pair of stilts. So if you imagine like one of your stilts is your ideals for work and the other is the reality of your job, if they're in pretty close alignment, then in principle, you can move forward. But it doesn't take much disalignment for them to make it impossible for you to move. Suddenly all you're thinking about is trying to hold them back together. And if they really get out of alignment, you stretch, you slip, and perhaps you even fall, as Napoleon is in this political cartoon. All right, so if that is a broad definition, then a little narrower definition of burnout comes from research. And it's very important to note at the outset that burnout has no clinical status in most countries. You can't be diagnosed with burnout the way you can with, generalized anxiety disorder or something like that. So it doesn't really have clinical status in the context that use the DSM-5, but it does have status in research. And researchers measure burnout along 3 dimensions. So the first dimension is exhaustion, or sometimes called emotional exhaustion. And this is probably fairly familiar to most of us. We know what it's like to be exhausted, to chronically not have the energy that we wish we had in order to get through our work days or other aspects of our lives. And often burnout is just equated straightforwardly with exhaustion. Even researchers say, well, burnout is just exhaustion and we won't worry about these other 2 dimensions. But I think that's a mistake. I think that you get the full nuances of the experience of burnout when you include these other dimensions. The second of which is cynicism, or sometimes called depersonalization. That's the idea that you start treating the people you work with, whether they are your coworkers or customers or clients or students or passengers on the bus or plane that you work on or something like that. You start treating them like less than the full human beings that they are. You become angry and embittered and cynical, and you detach from them. You see them as problems rather than people you're supposed to be helping through your work. Because I think we often don't think much about cynicism, I want to give a quick quote from a worker who confessed her cynicism to me when I was reporting for the book. And this is Liz. She's a social worker working in Dallas. And what Liz told me was at my last job, I got so burned out, I was put on leave of absence. I was lashing out at meetings. I was prickly, very pugnacious, ready at every turn to pick a fight. It was over dumb stuff that I didn't even care about. I was mad, and I wanted everyone else to be as mad and frustrated as I was. Liz also told me that, and Liz was a wonderful person to speak with because she's incredibly self-aware, and she was able to recognize this in herself. She eventually quit that job. But she said that she gossiped about coworkers. She'd be in the office, she'd constantly be gossiping. That was how her cynicism manifested itself. Okay, so exhaustion, cynicism, and then the third element, the third dimension of burnout is a sense of ineffectiveness, a sense that your work is not accomplishing anything. That sense of ineffectiveness doesn't necessarily mean you actually are ineffective, but Liz, I think, also makes an important point that that sense of ineffectiveness and that burnout that you get through stretching across that gap, it can ultimately make you ineffective. As she said, she's a social worker. We're no good for the community if we're burned out. She just cannot. You can't work in human services if you are cynical toward humans. And Liz had become that, and so she knew that she needed a different job. And yet, to measure these three dimensions, researchers use something called the Maslow Burnout Inventory, named after the researcher Christina Maslach, who was, to this day, really a pioneering burnout researcher. And it's a 22-question survey where you say, how frequently these various statements apply to you, every day on down to, very rarely. And so, for example, one of the questions is, or one of the statements is, being in direct contact with people at work is too stressful. So Liz would probably say that's pretty frequent. But that's one way of measuring burnout. If we want, so I don't actually have a slide on the prevalence of burnout, but with this definition, you get a little bit different picture. It's not 90% of workers. Not everyone is burned out. But in large studies of hospital systems in the US and Canada, this would have been pre-pandemic, these studies found pretty consistently that the workers in these hospital systems, between 5 and 10% were kind of classically burned out, in that they had high levels of exhaustion, cynicism, and a sense of ineffectiveness. But then about 50% scored high on one or two of those dimensions. So not burned out in the sense of they've got all three dimensions, but they've got one or two and are they're at risk of things becoming much worse, because generally speaking, the way burnout works is it's progressive. If you don't make some kind of intervention, it doesn't get better on its own. So it's worth paying attention to that 50% and not only the 7 or 8% who are classically burned out. Okay, so that's the individual side of burnout. But I also think we can say that we live in a burnout culture, because this gap exists on larger scales, not just in an individual's life, but in the workplace and on the societal level. So we can think of the gap in terms of what workers in general are promised and what their employers and culture actually deliver. And certainly in North America and many other societies, there are three main elements to the work ethic. So the promise that our societies make is that if you work hard, you get the social good of dignity, You get the moral good of character and the spiritual good of purpose. What do these things mean? Well, I think with the promise of dignity, the idea there is that through working, you earn the right to count in society. You matter. You can hold your head up as a productive citizen or something like that. People who do not have the flip side of this is that people who do not have paid employment are immediately suspect. Like, well, what's that about? Justify yourself. You're not working. Why? And you can also think about, if you go to like a public protest or something like that, there's always someone on like the fringes shouting, get a job, right? As if your rights to free speech and assembly are themselves contingent on paid employment. In addition, we often, because we only dignify people who can claim to be working, we rebrand things like, parenting, marriage, school as work. And those things have work-like elements, but you can't get fired from being a parent. You can't the children can't organize a union to win concessions over bedtime. I mean, there are limitations to that metaphor. But we automatically think, well, these are worthy activities, so they must be work. And I think that logic can become very pernicious. If they aren't work, then, well, what's the point? The second, character, the idea here is that working forms you morally and always for the better. This is something that we love to tell teenagers. If you get a job, you start learning the value of hard work and a paycheck, you'll stop becoming so lazy and you'll be more industrious. You'll develop grit, all of these other good virtues. And the third promise is that you work hard, you'll gain purpose in your life. Work gives your life meaning. You're contributing to higher goods, not just in society, but even in God's creation or God's kingdom. And so there is a religious version of this promise of spiritual purpose. And one very influential version of that promise comes from John Calvin. So Calvin, in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1536, wrote that everyone in his particular mode of life will, without repining, so without complaining, suffer its inconveniences, cares, uneasiness, and anxiety, persuaded that God has laid on the burden. In following your proper calling, no work will be so mean and sordid as not to have a splendor and value in the eye of God. So the idea here, you work hard, you identify your calling, you labor diligently in it. First of all, God has placed you in that calling. That calling is how you contribute to God's providential plan for the universe, and God sees it. God recognizes and smiles upon your labor. It gives you meaning. But there are also secular versions of this, and one very influential one comes from Steve Jobs, where he said that at Apple we're putting in this was in the 80s. He said this when Apple was a fraction of the size it is today. That we're putting in long hours at Apple because we're trying to make a little dent in the universe. We're going to make our mark. That's the purpose. So with these promises in mind, we have pretty high expectations for work, according to the current North American mythology. But actual jobs do not reliably fulfill this promise. And so that's why we have burnout culture. The reality is that often enough, you work hard and you're denied dignity, your character is corroded, and your work lacks purpose. So you may gain dignity in the sense of social recognition through your work, but you might lose it in other more concrete ways. So for instance, depending on the work that you do, your job you might have to give up your autonomy. You might have to give up your right to privacy. You might even, in some cases, have to give up your right to go to the bathroom during work hours. Additionally, work doesn't only form character, but it deforms it. If work can inculcate characteristics like grit in teenagers, well, it can also inculcate vices through repeated action. So those vices could include impatience, indifference to others. It could include building up technical skill at the cost of human empathy. So there are many ways that our jobs can deform our character in addition to forming it. And third, the purpose of our work is often rendered questionable by meaningless jobs, by burnout, by precarity, and by fluidity. The late anthropologist David Graeber gave a term bullshit jobs to jobs that have no apparent productive purpose, and even the person doing those jobs fails to see the purpose of them. And even if your job is incredibly meaningful, for instance, like a physician, there are usually meaningless elements to it that feel like a waste of time. Physicians in some health systems report spending half their day on data entry. I mean, no one goes to medical school so that they can do data entry. And yet that's what physicians are often doing. And I know as a patient, I've seen this firsthand many times. And no surprise, there's a very high burnout rate in the medical profession. Additionally, that Calvinist notion of vocation assumes a kind of stability and visible productivity that jobs in the 21st century in our post-industrial era just don't typically have, or don't have quite as much of. So you think of Calvin's, kind of 16th century, French or Swiss farmer doing, working on the land, or you think about a 19th century craftsman, and compare that to a 21st century value-based healthcare associate or clearing member representative. These are, titles that I have come across. Apologies to any value-based healthcare associates or clearing member representatives here in the audience. What if your product is not, a bushel of grain, but a user experience or shareholder value? That's much more abstract. It's much more difficult to see the fruit of your labor, and it can become more meaningless. And if we work in an office at all, we spend hours a day typing. What differentiates the work of a physician from an accountant, from a sales representative, is not the physical actions that they do. They're all doing exactly the same physical action. They're sitting at a desk and they're typing. What differentiates the work they do is invisible and abstract. It's in the software that none of us can see. So all of these aspects of work in our post-industrial economy work against that very lofty promise. And to be sure, work is not this bad for everyone. Some of you may feel quite fulfilled by your work, but the promise is empty enough for enough people that we can't, in good faith, keep making it. Getting beyond burnout culture, then, is going to have to mean we're closing that gap. And we're going to have to close the gap between the ideals for work and the reality of our jobs from both sides, probably by lowering the ideals and improving that reality. And I want to say that the Catholic intellectual and spiritual tradition has resources that can help. One quick caveat is that, a big part of the problem, as I mentioned, is, I'm going the wrong direction. Sorry for the early preview. Is that, this work ethic, we often call it, the Protestant ethic, and it does have roots in in Calvinism, but I'm in no way trying to say that, Protestantism caused this problem and Catholicism has the solution. Far from it. In fact, the Catholic tradition has very often been complicit in promoting this false promise. If you don't believe me, think about the concept of vocation and how it works in Catholicism. It's very often a kind of exploitative concept, or it can be used to cover exploitative work conditions. But at its best, the Catholic tradition does offer an alternative to this work ethic, and I want to share that with you this evening. So, how I think the Catholic alternative to burnout culture, I think, also has three elements. That the social dimension is that dignity is independent of work. Dignity, you don't get more dignity on the basis of working than you already have, just by virtue of being alive. The moral dimension is that every worker deserves compassion. And the spiritual dimension is that we find our highest purpose not in work, but in leisure. So let me explain. So this idea of dignity not depending on work is, of course, contrary to the idea that you gain dignity, you earn dignity through work. And the idea here is that all people have inherent worth, just by virtue of being human. You have this inherent worth, this dignity, before you ever go to work, and if you never go to work. You can't earn more dignity than you have by virtue of being human. Now, sometimes you'll hear that, well, hold on a minute here. The purpose, according to the book of Genesis, of human life is to work. The first man was created, placed in the garden to till and keep it, and therefore we as humans must work. That's how we fulfill our reason for being. But I don't think this is a good reading of Genesis. So first of all, in Genesis 1, there's the notion that human beings are made in God's image and likeness, that just by being made, you have this divinity or this dignity within you. But it's also in Genesis 2. So the first human being is created in verse 7 before there's any work to do. There isn't even a garden yet. There's nowhere for this guy to live. And he's created and he is loved. He has not worked yet. It's only 8 verses later that God has created the garden and places the man in it to till and keep it. And work doesn't even become especially difficult until a whole chapter later, after the fall, and then work becomes obligatory. And if you jump ahead to the New Testament, in Matthew 6, there's the sermon about the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. Jesus says, hey, they don't work, and God takes care of them. Doesn't God love you that much more? Aren't you worth more to God than the birds and the lilies? If they're not worried, you shouldn't worry. You shouldn't have to fret about working so much. This idea gets expressed, in a more kind of systematic theological way in John Paul II's 1981 encyclical Laborem Exercens on human work. And John Paul makes an important distinction between the subjective and objective dimensions of work. So the objective would be the material conditions of work, the material productivity of work, things like that. The subjective dimensions would be, the inner kind of human elements of work. And John Paul locates the dignity of work in the subjective. That's where work finds its dignity and its meaning, not in the objective elements. So here's a passage from that. The basis for determining the value of human work is not primarily the kind of work being done, but, and I love this next phrase, the fact that the one who is doing it is a person. Each sort of work is judged above all by the measure of the dignity of the subject of work, that is to say, the person, the individual who carries it out. Why is there dignity in work? because human beings work. We give work its dignity and not the other way around. What I take this to mean that, we already have this dignity by virtue of being human beings, and the objective conditions of work need to measure up to that. I think we often think about it in the other terms, like, well, work has dignity, you don't. You need to work in order to gain that dignity. It actually works in the exact opposite direction in John Paul's thinking. We have dignity, and our working conditions ought to live up to that. So this principle of dignity leads into the second principle, that each worker deserves compassion. So if dignity pays attention to the universal characteristic of the worker as a human being, then compassion pays attention to the specific needs of the individual worker and makes sure those needs are met so that the worker can do the best they're capable of in the most humane conditions. So what that means are things like, those conditions can include schedule, physical conditions, mental conditions, and so on. We need to be compassionate toward people's vulnerabilities and susceptibility to negative conditions. And this idea is, I think, best expressed 90 years before John Paul in Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum. So here's Leo. Daily labor should be so regulated as not to be protracted over longer hours than strength admits. And of course, we all have different strength. How many and how long the intervals of rest should be must depend on the nature of the work, on the circumstances of time and place, and on the health and strength of the worker. Those who work in mines and quarries and extract coal, stone, and metals from the bowels of the earth should have shorter hours in proportion as their labor is more severe and trying to health. We often, again, do things the complete opposite way. Those who do this physically demanding work often have very long hours. But Leo says, well, we're all different. We have different conditions. We work in different conditions. The conditions in outdoor work in, Ontario versus in Texas are going to necessitate different schedules, probably. And yet Leo still thinks that every worker is deserving of a living wage. So we're all deserving of a living wage, but to earn that wage, we need conditions that are adapted to our individual capacities and strengths. This means that there is no one-size-fits-all work week. And I love what Leo says about miners. And we might apply those words about miners to nurses, for instance, who work long hours on their feet and in stressful conditions. Or we could apply it to food pickers or warehouse pickers who deserve reasonable hours, reasonable pace of work, water, bathroom breaks, and so on. The third big principle, again, is leisure. That the purpose of our life is found primarily in leisure rather than work. And here, I want to turn to the German Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper and his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. In fact, Pieper was a staunch anti-communist, as was Leo and as was John Paul. But what I find so fascinating about their work is that their critiques apply equally well to capitalist societies. What Pieper saw in post-World War II Europe was a world of what he called total work, where your value as a person was completely delimited by the work that you do, and that your work defines you as a human being. The total work is a distortion. We do not live primarily for work, but, Pieper argues, for leisure. And the reason is that leisure activates our whole being in a way that work does not. And so we find our highest purpose in leisure. So, one more quote. Wow, I think I removed my jacket. It's okay. So what does Pieper say? He says, the power to know leisure is the power to overstep the boundaries of the workaday world and reach out to superhuman, life-giving existential forces that refresh and renew us before we turn back to our daily work. Only in genuine leisure does a gateway to freedom open. And for Pieper, leisure doesn't just include, it's not just rest, it's not just a break. It includes contemplation, which he sees as a passive element of our knowledge and learning that nevertheless reaches out to the divine. Contemplation is receptive to truth, and yet you're still getting truth. There's the active search for truth, but there's also a passive search for truth. And Pieper sees that passive search for truth in contemplation, which he connects to leisure. But leisure is also found in festivity. He says, the soul of leisure lies in celebration. Celebration is the point at which the three elements of leisure come into focus: relaxation, effortlessness, and the superiority of active leisure to all functions. More Pieper here. But if celebration is the core of leisure, then leisure can only be made possible and justifiable on the same basis as the celebration of a festival. That basis is divine worship. So for Pieper, festivity is the soul of leisure, and the highest form of festivity is divine worship. And so within Catholicism, the highest form of human, festivity and worship is the Eucharist. So he sees the Eucharist as the highest form of leisure and an anticipation of the heavenly banquet festival. If you think about, the heavenly banquet, what's a banquet like? Well, it's fun, it's eating, it's drinking, it's festivity. Like Peter's like, yeah, that's what we're aiming for. Now together, these three pillars, so dignity not based on work, compassion for each and every worker, and our meaning to be found in leisure. These three pillars shift the stakes of work in a way that can help close the gap between promise and reality. So the principle of human dignity means that employers should offer conditions that are commensurate with that dignity. The principle of compassion means every worker deserves conditions that accommodate for their specific needs. And the principle of leisure means that work is not the end-all and be-all of our existence. And that, lowers the stakes of work. The meaning of your life is not on the line when you're going to work anymore. All of that is the theoretical side of what the Catholic tradition can contribute to limiting burnout culture. What about the practical? And I think the Catholic tradition has much to offer here, too. And I want to look specifically at communities of Benedictine religious to find these practical models of how to keep work within humane limits so that it doesn't overtake our spiritual lives. The Benedictine motto is ora et labora, so prayer and work. It sounds like there should be an equal balance, but I don't think that that's true. The question is, how do Benedictines balance prayer and work within their communities? And what can we, who live in what Benedictines sometimes call the world, have to learn from them? So to find out, I went here in 2017, the most beautiful place I have ever been in my life. This is the Monastery of Christ in the Desert in northern New Mexico. It really looks like this. So it's this isolated canyon. To get there, you turn off of the highway and you follow a 13-mile dirt road that is impassable if it rains or if there's snow to this place. The monks, they generate their own electricity. They pump their own water from the river. They have propane trucked in for heating, and they live off the grid like this for a reason, to kind of get away from the world, and as I see it, to get away from the worldly work ethic. In addition, I've interviewed monks and sisters at 2 monasteries in Minnesota for a model of kind of Benedictine life and work that's a little bit closer to worldly existence. Benedictines, they're modern people living by a pre-modern rule written in 530. The rule of St. Benedict does not have all of our modern industrial age baggage, which is why I think it's a great source for rethinking our assumptions about work. And at Christ in the Desert, they try to interpret the rule pretty rigorously. They try to live as Benedict intended by limiting anything that will interfere with their adherence to the rule. And, you know, the desert fathers and mothers who in some way these monks were trying to imitate wrote a lot about their battles with demons. And when I visited Christ in the Desert, I started to think of the work ethic as a demon, as a temptation that can lead us to abandon our higher spiritual aspirations. And the monks at Christ in the Desert take several measures to fight this demon, to limit their identification with work, and, you know, again, adhere more strictly to the rule. They have to work in order to sustain their community. They need to generate some revenue, but they manage to keep their work in check so that they can pursue spiritual goals outside of work. So not necessarily an equal balance between ora and labora. The most obvious way that the monks at Christ in the Desert limit their work is through their schedule, which is built around 7 periods of communal prayer, plus Mass and private prayer and meditation. So in all, they're spending at least 5 hours a day in prayer. And I think this is a good example of the highest purpose being found in leisure. We don't think of prayer as leisure, but it fits Pieper's definition. Again, Pieper thinks that leisure is, the highest form of leisure is divine worship. And the Benedictines take that, I think, pretty seriously. At this monastery in particular, the first office of prayer is at 4 a.m. And they're in the chapel for about 2.5 hours. Then they, kind of clean up. They come back to the chapel. They have breakfast. And then their work period begins at 9 o'clock in the morning and lasts until about 12:30. Then they have another office of prayer. They have their main meal of the day. And then they have, other activities in the afternoon. But they generally don't go back to work. They need to accomplish everything that they need to do in a day in that 3.5 hours in the morning because they don't want it to get in the way of this. They don't want it to get in the way of their prayer. And I asked one monk who had been a defense attorney. So this is someone who's very familiar with, the work ethic. I said, well, what happens if you're in the middle of something and the chapel bell rings and you have to end your work and go back to the chapel? He said, you get over it. And this struck me as like the greatest spiritual wisdom I've ever heard. And as a really important spiritual discipline, like getting over it should be, a spiritual discipline that we talk more about. But it says, look, the work will still be there the next day at 9. We have something more important to do for now. And in fact, the rule of Benedict says nothing is to be preferred to the work of God. And by work of God, he means the communal prayer. So schedule, that's one way that Benedictines limit work. Some others include rotating their duties. This is Benedictines at Christ in the Desert, in a wood shop. But in addition, they have guests to host. They have to cook for each other. They have to serve each other. And there isn't a permanent cook or server or dishwasher at the monastery. When it's, Brother Leo's week to cook and he's a terrible cook, you just have to deal with that. Exactly. You get another thing to get over. And I think that the wisdom behind this is that it limits your identification with that job. You're like, no, you're a monk. You're a member of this community. You're not a cook. You're a cook this week, but you won't be next week. It breaks down that strong sense of role identification. And it breaks down the tendency of work to ingrain deformative habits. If you are a very skilled worker, Benedict offers a caution to you, saying that if you are a skilled worker, you have to practice in all humility. And if you can't do so, then it doesn't matter how lucrative your work is. The abbot's responsibility is to remove you from it. Because again, there's something more important than your productivity. I mean, this is the exact opposite of what we do in our, in the world. If someone has a talent, work that talent as much as possible. Get them to be as productive as possible, to make as much money as possible. If they're not humble about it, who cares? That doesn't matter. It's productivity that matters. In the Benedictine monastery, what matters is humility. I have an example. This is not an exact instance of that problem, that chapter 58, 57 from the rule. But at Christ in the Desert in the 1990s, they decided to become remote online workers. Well, we're in the middle of nowhere, but there's this new thing that we can do. We can fulfill, we can do what monks have been doing for centuries. We can be scribes. And so we're going to have a web design business. So they got quite a bit of attention. They did a front page story in the New York Times, cover of Time magazine, and elsewhere. And the orders started to come in. And just as the business was about to take off, the abbot closed up shop. And I asked him about this. Well, why would you do that? He said, well, it took a long time to train monks to do this work, and they would get trained on the web design, but then they would have to go to seminary to be ordained. Or, the work that it takes, you can't do in 3-hour chunks. You got to be working a much longer schedule. And so it's like, well, we just couldn't do this work, which had the potential to be very lucrative, and adhere to the rule. The rule wins, the work loses. And it's like, well, we'll figure out some other way to make money. Again, no company would do that, right? But they did. Because the idea is that work needs to serve communal needs. Some other principles that I learned from Benedictine communities in Minnesota is, for one thing, like in a Benedictine community, there isn't really a sense of retirement in the way that we normally do. I mean, that sounds like it's a lack of limits on work. But I think that, there's always something for a monk or a sister to do to benefit the community. The community does not view its members as used up once they reach retirement age. They still are needed to make a contribution. But that contribution is determined by their capacities. So, for instance, at St. John's monastery in central Minnesota, I met a 90-year-old monk who ran the Abbey gift shop. His real vocation there, his real ministry, was just kind of like gabbing with visitors, as much as it was like selling candles and crosses. This was not strenuous work, but it was work he could do. It was work he was great at. He was great at chatting with visitors and making them feel welcome at age 90. Not too far from that monastery, there's a women's monastery that also has a kind of retirement home. It has a nursing care facility that has many sisters living in it, and those sisters have a role to do too. They can't do a lot of revenue generating work, but they can pray. and they're counted on by people outside of the monastery saying, hey, will the sisters pray for this or for this? And I spoke with a sister who, her job is to figure out sometimes what these prayer requests are, and to pass them on to sisters at the nursing facility, so they have, they will do these prayers. They will intercede on behalf of these people who are sending their prayers to the monastery. So they have something to contribute to. What I think these monks and sisters have done is they've detached dignity, character, and purpose from work completely. Maybe not, nobody's perfect, right? But work matters to them. And it matters especially to sisters and monks I met who do active ministry at universities or schools in the area. But the community is where they find the goods that we in secular life so often try to find through our work. And I think that this is, these different models of Benedictine life, whether it's more remote or more engaged with the world, I think that they show that, there are possibilities here to incorporate elements of the Benedictine tradition into 21st century working life. I don't think Benedict's message is that we all need to go into the desert, but rather to, in a sense, build monasteries, within our lives or within our workplaces, and adhere in some way to some of these principles of, embodying the idea that of dignity and compassion and purpose that the monks and sisters do. I want to conclude by mentioning one final principle from Catholic social teaching that's an indispensable tool for dismantling burnout culture and building something more humane, and that's solidarity. To beat burnout, we're going to have to demand less of each other in our communities and maybe promise each other less. That means that our workplaces may need to say no to many calls to do more and more, to expand their missions and their revenue streams. But it also means saying yes to something, yes to more empathy, yes to more respect, yes to more justice and to more compassion. Because the fact is that my actions affect your burnout and vice versa. The people that you work with are connected to each other. One person's actions, one person's cynicism affects another and vice versa. So the question can't be only, how can I prevent my burnout? It has to be, how can I prevent yours? Thank you very much. And stay up here, please. Okay.
Thank you, Jonathan. My name is Peter Meehan. I'm St. Jerome's president, and it's my pleasure to open up the floor to questions. So if you have any questions, we have microphones in the middle and on the right, and on the left, my right and my left. Please feel free.
This is maybe a comment as much of a question. I was just saying to my colleague, a lot of people of my vintage bemoan millennials and Gen Zs, they don't want to work hard enough. But it seems to me that from what you're saying, that's the way we should be listening to these young people in terms of how to run our workplaces. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think that it's I'm unsure what a sociologist or a social psychologist would say about, I haven't seen really good data on, different generations' commitment to the work ethic or something like that. But yeah, to the extent it's true that we should have a little bit less commitment to work, then yeah, I do think that that's right. And, you hear about these trends like, quiet quitting or something like that. And it's hard to say how much stock to put in that because, the data that people use to describe these trends, just kind of comes from TikTok, which it's just difficult. It's hard to pin down, what might be behind some of that language. But yeah, I mean, the certainly, I think it's true that if it's true that the younger generations are maybe a bit less committed, then that could be really good.
Just don't tell my son that.
Okay, no, right, yeah, he should. Let me just say, my own position. I mean, I teach part-time at a university, and I want my students to, like in a theoretical way, I want them to reject the work ethic. But if they don't turn in their homework, like, come on, you gotta work, you gotta put in the effort. So, do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, you have given us a lot to think about, and I have so many thoughts running through my head that I hope I can encapsulate them into some sort of a question. One of the thoughts I had, and with all respect to the Benedictines, is that it is a bit of a luxury to move yourself away from the center of society and into the desert where you can take the time to contemplate. I like to contemplate too, but when we work in an institution, the institution is not the caring place. And I love that you said it's the people within. When I retired, which was not long ago, it was an impromptu little gathering of people, and they asked me to say something. And all I said was, our job is hard. Rely on each other, support each other. We need each other because we do good work, but we're not going to get the support from outside, not from the community, not from sometimes the administration, not from the higher parts of the institution. And it's a problem, especially if the institution is tied to a higher moral teaching. Mm-hmm. So, and then my third thought, I'm sorry, these are thoughts, not questions, but perhaps you can comment on them. That'll be my question. Could you comment on these?
Sure.
My third thought was women. So you didn't specifically cite women. However, there was a time, my mom she was a secretary when she came to Canada, and then she had me and she stayed home. And she was a great cook. She was a great housekeeper. She did all that. I want to do that too. I also worked full time. I had 3 kids, not 2, I want to do things well. We take on so much as women, and the busyness of our lives, schedules, they scheduled prayer. We schedule, the shuttle to the hockey game and to music lessons and all the other different things we do. It's almost overwhelming, and if you don't have a supportive spouse who recognizes this and who also is cognizant of these things, burnout happens at home too. So you're at work and burnt out, you're at home and burnt out, you're just plain burnt out. Women are burnt out. Anyway, could you comment on this?
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try to hit each point kind of quickly. I mean, first, I think in a way there's a kind of luxury in being able to support yourself. I mean, the monks in Christ in the Desert are partially supported by donations, but not totally. And I mean, they're giving up. I mean, poverty, right? Like they take a vow of poverty. That doesn't mean they're living in total material deprivation, but they've separated themselves from their families, and in many cases, by thousands of miles. And they've given up career ambition, they've given up family life, they've given up a lot of other things. And so there's still a cost, I think, to their way of life. And the second point, yeah, I mean, I think that we almost can't help but work in institutions. And from a university to a monastery to a coffee shop, and so on. These are all institutions. And I think that the great thing is that, these are, sociologists talk about social constructions. And I'm like, great, it's great that this is a social construction. Like, we're society, so let's see how we can reconstruct them, see if we can, to some degree, you may be working against the institution in order to create space where you're going to be able to work well and with compassion. But I think there also needs to be a sense of reformulating our institutions around some of these guidelines. And the third, burnout. So the history of burnout, it was kind of first theorized and studied in like the 1970s. So the first papers on burnout started appearing in like 1972, 73. And it was first identified in workers, most of whom were women. So it was, social workers, nurses, teachers, these professions that certainly at the time, and I suppose still today, are kind of, well, they're not just coded as female. Most of the workers, were women. And it was identified because, yes, these women were, were in the workplace, and many, of course, were also, had families and were doing quite a bit of domestic labor at home. To the point where, there's, it can sometimes seem like burnout is, I don't know if I want to say predominantly, but like at least more than 50%, like a female phenomenon. And there are studies that indicate that, for like big studies of physicians that show, female physicians are like 30% more susceptible to burnout. So there's definitely, and then, one kind of glaring explanation for that is the sort of second shift, that's going on for a lot of those physicians. In any case, the point is that, what we do in, the things that we do outside of work have an impact on us as people, and they can, make work more difficult as well. And so, I don't mean to say that it's that burnout has nothing to do with other areas of life. I think it absolutely does. And given the kinds of pressures that, more women than men on average are exposed to, it's no surprise to see the data come out that way.
Thank you. That was good. I was also thinking, as you're saying this, that women tend to be more emotional. They tend to be more on that level, connecting personally with people. They invest themselves that way. They are more human being and interested in that personalism than, and I'm not painting men black, but than many men. Many men are interested in productivity and doing and getting it done, get the job done, get the work done. And it also occurs to me that, here we are in a Catholic institution. Jesus is so countercultural. And until we embrace that kind of a vision with that same countercultural kind of ideology, we're not going to get there. So we need to embrace that personalism, that time alone, that pulling away, and putting our Christian words into action. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on that?
Well, I'll just say one thing real quick. I think about cynicism, and, if you work as a nurse, teacher, social worker, et cetera, cynicism is total poison. Like, you can't do your job. But we have all these archetypes of, cynical male workers, like, House, for instance, or like the hard-boiled detective. Cynicism is bad no matter what you're doing, but I think that it's kind of, socially coded in a way that makes cynicism almost like a requirement of some jobs that, are more traditionally done by men.
Michael.
Yes. I was taking a break from working there. This was a great talk. I had no idea other than there was a little title about what this was going to be about. And the first thing that for me that happened was I did a course over the last 2 years, which was very, I'm sort of in the wake of it right now. It was great. I chose to do it and I engaged in it. And when I read those 3 things, I thought every one of them fits into what I experienced there. Now, there wasn't any lack of dignity, but what's the word that was beside dignity? Was it character? Yeah. So maybe that one didn't count, but the other one's exhaustion, and the last one, which was, what was the last one?
Purpose.
Purpose, yeah. I sort of lost sight. Ineffectiveness. There was one part in there where you have a sense of ineffectiveness. So because I did the course, it was great. I got a lot out of it, but I did leave it feeling that I wasn't as effective as I should have been. And I definitely left it feeling, oh my God, how did I even manage to do that? It was sort of something that out of the blue. But anyways, the thing that I'm getting now is when I hear like the ability to be able to separate work from income, and actually to get rid of the word work. And I hear the replacement word for that for me is we find, I mean, this is a common thing to say, but we find our passion. In a world in which we don't have to go to work, I believe that if you raise a child without the need to know that you're going to have to earn a living, you might say to them, you're going to have to make a contribution to this community and find your passion. And that's what I see. So, and I often think that if we can separate the need to work to make money so we can do what we want to do in our lives, if we can get rid of that paradigm, it opens up this unbelievable work. I think there's a show on TV called Moonscape. I don't know if I think that's the name of it, but it's a fictional show about Earthlings that go to the moon. And one of the things, and they create a whole community there. It's a show that's still available. And all they do is play all day. Everything's taken care of. There are some greenhouses where they go in there and work, but it's not like a paid job. So I imagine that ability to separate the word work, to get rid of it, at least in the meaning that we have for it, which is all those things you said. It defines our dignity. It defines all these things about us, and grow a world that's about what is your passion and what contribution do you want to make. I mean, that sounds like an unbelievable world. Because I think about the years that are eaten up in a human life, toiling at something that doesn't fulfill people, which is an epidemic. And the other thing I was thinking about in relation to that, if I could, maybe I'll do the same thing as the lady. You could comment on that. The other thing I was thinking is that, okay, I'm not going to go because I can't remember. But anyways, if you could comment on that. Well, no, actually what it was, I remember it now. It's to figure out how to provide for people without the need for them to work 40 hours a week. And to get over that being, like talk about get over it, get over the fact that somehow isn't fair. You can't have somebody not work and get money or get taken care of, which I think is maybe something we also to let go of. So anyways, what do you...
That's right, yeah, thank you. And I think that, again, Benedictine communities have some wisdom for us here. I mean, we do need productivity. Like, we need the earth to be, productive so that we can eat, right? And there's a lot of productivity that we need. But, the Benedictines, one of the vows they make is stability of life. So I'm pledging myself to this community for the rest of my life. But there's a reciprocal promise on the part of the community. It's like, all right, well, we're going to provide for you. And we're going to provide for you no matter what. And that, I think, is sort of, a model maybe of some of what you might be talking about, that the promises that our society actually makes is like, well, you better work or you're in big trouble. You're a slacker, you're a loser. Benedict himself complains about the slackers among the monks a little bit, but the focus is on contribution. How can you contribute to this community? And you matter. You are part of this community, for the rest of your life, and we will provide for you. So what I like about that is it does take that pressure off. You don't have to maximize the productivity of every moment in that case.
Okay, we've got time for two more.
Great.
Toby?
Wondering if you could comment on two things. One is that it's a personal conviction that I think we've been sold on technologies that are supposed to be more efficient and streamline things so that we can free up leisure. We keep buying into these things that actually complicate our lives even more or aren't as reliable as people say. And I'll just, at the parish I'm at, St. Mary's, when we take in payments 5 different ways now, equally in all directions. We used to take in payment one way, and it was easier, okay? It's just one example, and all kinds of other ways in which we communicate. So that's one thing. If you could comment on that, please, in terms of like freeing up this leisure time, I completely agree with that. And then the second thing I want to just ask your opinion on is that we've bought into the culture of educating when we're young, generally speaking, then really working in those years of proficiency in our middle ages, and then the leisure comes later, if we have the health for it, okay? So there are movements and pushes for doing it all throughout our lives in 3 equal parts. Okay, and that's more, I think, what you're getting at. If you can talk about some initiatives that you may know or how you think a culture that still has bought into that compartmentalizing of the education, work, and leisure model happening in those phases of our lives. So leave that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate, both of those points. I mean, I think that it's certainly true that it does seem like, right, technology often does end up, multiplying our work. And again, I think about physicians who are doing so much, data entry, they're spending so much time on electronic health records, which are supposed to kind of streamline care. And I mean, it doesn't seem, I've yet to see kind of like the payoff of those records. I mean, because anyway, I could just complain about, the healthcare system in the US, but I won't. But at the same time, I mean, yet again, the Benedictines offer a model. They were, in the Middle Ages, they were real innovators in mill technology. Because we got all this grain to grind, and it's a pain, and it's taking away from our prayers. So they figured out, well, what if we get mules to do the grinding? What if we get water to do the grinding? What if we get the air to do the grinding? Well, then we can spend more time in community. So there can be, I mean, it's possible for technology to save our labor, but I don't know what has to go right in order to make that happen. And again, I mean, I totally agree that, it's so sad to talk to my university students who, the word that I mean, they don't all say it, but I sometimes, I'm saying like, well, what, shouldn't you, take a more contemplative approach to, study, and like maybe you won't make so much money and all that, but no, but you don't get it. Like, if I work really hard and I make a lot of money, then I'll get to retire and I'll have better leisure than I would have had before. And, that's, like I said, I think that's sad. I don't know, there's no such thing as better leisure. There's not better and worse leisure. There's just leisure and not leisure. And, I worry that those students are going to be really disappointed when they get to the point they've been waiting for, and they realize, well, wait a minute, this isn't any better than the leisure I could have had 30, 40 years ago. So in any case, I think that you're onto something there.
Thank you.
Sean.
Did you want to go?
No, you were ahead of me. Go ahead.
Okay. So Thank you, John. I just have a couple questions or comments too. So just to follow up with Toby in terms of technology too, like with young people, like the kids are plugged in all the time, right? So I think that leads to the burnout because you're always accessible. You're never downloading. You're never stepping away from the tech. First thing you do and wake up in the morning, last thing you do late at night, right? So, there's just, we're in Lent, right? We want to take time to be still. We want to take time to pray and to fast. So, I remember those days when the power went out, like hours, right? And at the end of the day, you had to light the fire and the candles. And then after that, like, Mom, can we do this again? Right? Like there was a joy in that sort of reclaiming the Sabbath, reclaiming those moments of rest, right? And incorporating those moments in. So whether you unplug technology, whether you set time aside to do some simple things, I think that also adds to it. So it's not just a leisure, a Benedictine style, because that's hard to do. It's a challenge. But reclaiming the Sabbath daily, if you can, reclaiming the Sabbath, and that not just recreation, but the recreation element that comes with that, weekly, right? And spending time present to people and not texting and actually having conversations and being with, right? Being present. So that's been more of a move. I know in our family, we try to fast from technology as part of our Lenten element, right? Earth Day, things like that. And those sort of renew, right? They bring to that. The other thing I was commenting on or mentioned is that, and this came up, right? I want to have dignity. I want to have purpose. I want to have character. That's so often associated with how much I bring home. Like if I can't make the money, I can't put gas in the car. I can't go to work. I can't pay the mortgage. So there is a grind to it. There's just a basic reality to it, right? There's a pragmatic reality, and it is associated with my dignity, my sense of worth, my sense of my character is tied to my paycheck and my dollar value, and that is the base reality for so many people, right? And the debt, that we're carrying is astronomical as a country, and certainly, in North America, and students come out with it, right? So, that's a big push. So you work hard because you got to get a little extra coin, right? And that's just part of the reality of it too. So just some of those comments, but really the recreation or recreation and reclaiming the Sabbath, I think, is something to strive for.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the thing, is like kind of something to strive for. So I'd say that, we don't all have to run out to the desert and give up our jobs. We don't need to turn every day into Sunday. Even Pieper doesn't think we should do that. But it could be like, this Father Simeon at Christ in the Desert has said, like, you get over it. Like, it's a spiritual discipline. And, we're not always great at our spiritual disciplines. Think about like Lenten disciplines and how well are people doing those, but it's something to strive for. And even if, I know I still have that feeling that like, my value is partly determined by my earning power. Like I haven't gotten over that, but I'm trying to get over it. And like, I think that's, I don't know, that's maybe all we can do.
Okay, I think that's about all the time we've got for this evening. Please join me in thanking our guest speaker, Dr. Jonathan Malesic. Before we conclude, I'd like to offer a few thank yous and reminders. Thank you to all of you for being here with us tonight to help live out St. Jerome's mission to be mission to be a place where thoughtful people think hopefully about the major issues facing the church and the world. Thank you to Jamie Phillip and Courtney and her team in events here at St. Jerome's for all the work that they've done to help make tonight possible. Thank you to our facilities team who set up tonight's space for those attending in person, and to our IT team, including Chloe, as well as Norm Clare from the Unmarketing Group, for helping to facilitate a live stream for those unable to join in person. A recording will be posted to our website, and we welcome you to share this with folks that you know who may not have been able to attend this evening. Thank you to our partners at Dana Hospitality for tonight's beverages and snacks. We encourage you to continue to enjoy those before you head home. We hope to see you back at St. Jerome's for our next lecture in Catholic Experience on March 21st at 7:30 p.m., when our guest will be sociologist Dr. Tricia Bruce. director of the Springtide Research Institute in Winona, Minnesota, and recently announced by the Holy See as one of 6 new consultants appointed to the General Secretariat of the Synod on Synodality for its upcoming 2nd session this fall in Rome. Dr. Bruce's lecture, entitled Her Place in the Church, Gender, Power, and Authority in Contemporary Catholicism, addresses the role gender has long played in the roles men and women in the Catholic Church play, particularly in regard to religious life. Drawing on hundreds of interviews, Dr. Bruce compares the prospects and parameters of women's leadership at 2 moments in the Church, following Vatican II and today. I hope you can be with us. Thanks so much.